The air in the room was heavy that evening, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural even in the most peaceful of homes. The walls of their California estate, once filled with laughter and promises whispered in confidence, now seemed to listen in silence, absorbing the tension between the couple. Prince Harry sat on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands, fingers digging into his scalp as if trying to pull the truth from his own mind before it unraveled completely. Across from him, Meghan sat with arms crossed, her gaze distant, unflinching. It was a moment that no one outside that room was meant to witness. But it was precisely that illusion of privacy that was now shattered. As Harry struggled to find words, one thought kept echoing in his mind, louder than anything either of them could say aloud. She had been recording their private conversations. Not just one, not by accident, not in a fleeting, careless moment. Deliberately, repeatedly. The woman he had trusted with the deepest parts of himself had been documenting their most vulnerable moments. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. She was writing our ending before I even knew we had one, Harry would later confess. His words, simple yet devastating, struck at something universal. The fear that love itself can be betrayed not by infidelity, but by exploitation. That vulnerability shared in the quiet of intimate moments can become fodder for public consumption, and that the very act of baring one's soul can one day be used against you. But how did it come to this? How did one of the most fairy tale romances in modern royal history deteriorate into allegations of deceit, betrayal, and emotional devastation? This video will take you deep into that emotional journey. From the dizzying heights of their courtship to the chilling discovery that would redefine everything Harry thought he knew about the woman he had chosen as his life partner. We'll explore the human side of this royal scandal, the love, the hope, the heartbreak. We'll ask uncomfortable questions. Was this a calculated strategy from the beginning? Was Meghan preparing her own narrative before their relationship had even begun to fracture? Or was this simply a misguided attempt to capture memories, misunderstood and misinterpreted? Imagine sitting across from your partner, the person you confide in at your weakest, who holds your secrets and your heart, and realizing that those quiet confessions had been taped. That every tearful apology, every late-night conversation about fears, doubts, family tensions was meticulously documented. For a future book, a memoir that might one day be read by millions. Harry's world, already defined by loss, scrutiny, and trauma, would be thrown into a deeper chaos. And the public, ever fascinated by the inner workings of royal lives, would soon be left asking, where does the line between personal and public truly lie? For Harry, this was no longer about media intrusion. This was about betrayal from within. A wound inflicted not by tabloids or photographers lurking outside the gates, but by the very person who had once promised to stand beside him against all that noise. In the coming chapters of this story, we will walk through every step of this unraveling. We will peel back the layers of a relationship that seemed, at least to the outside world, almost too perfect. We will hear the echoes of private pain, see the cracks that widened behind closed doors, and understand the profound loneliness of a man who has lost so much, and may have lost again, in a way he never expected. This is not a simple tale of celebrity gossip or royal scandal. It's a deeply human story about trust, betrayal, and the devastating cost of fame and exposure. And it is a reminder that even those born into privilege and wealth are not immune to heartbreak, or to the anguish that comes when love itself is called into question. Throughout this journey, you'll be invited to think deeply. What does it mean when private love becomes public spectacle? What is the true price of sharing your life with someone and with the world? How do we navigate the delicate balance between vulnerability and self-protection? As you watch and listen, you will feel the weight of Harry's heartbreak, the rawness of his realization, and the echo of every conversation that was no longer theirs alone. But there's something even more striking that you'll come to see as this story unfolds. This wasn't just a betrayal between two people. This was a betrayal that reverberated through an entire family, the House of Windsor. And perhaps even a betrayal that mirrored, in haunting ways, Harry's own childhood wounds. When his mother, Princess Diana, sat down for that now infamous BBC interview and bared her soul to the world, She did so out of pain and isolation, feeling unheard and unseen by the very institution she had married into. Decades later, Harry's own private pain would once again be made public, but this time, not by an institution, not by an aggressive press corps, but allegedly by his own wife. And so, before we dive into the chapters ahead, take a breath and imagine the emotional toll of such a discovery. Picture Harry walking into a quiet room, glancing down at Meghan's writing desk and finding notes, transcripts, fragments of their lives together, not preserved out of nostalgia, but curated as future material. The conversations where he had been at his most vulnerable now reduced to pages in a notebook, destined perhaps for a memoir deal negotiated before their marriage even faltered. Was this the plan all along? Or had Meghan simply convinced herself that documenting their journey would somehow be healing? That one day, the world would understand their love through her words? These are the questions Harry has had to confront, alone, isolated, and torn between loyalty to the woman he loved and the crushing weight of betrayal. And these are the questions we will explore together. You may find yourself sympathizing with Harry, feeling the ache of his loss. Or you may see things differently, wondering if perhaps Meghan's intentions were more complicated than they seem, driven by a life under constant media attack, a need to control her own narrative in a world eager to define her. But what is certain is this: nothing about this story is simple. It is layered, raw, and deeply emotional. And as we move through the chapters, we'll unravel not just the events themselves, but the feelings, the conflicts, and the motivations that drove this relationship to the brink. So stay with us. Let your mind and heart open to the complexities of this narrative. Ask yourself throughout, what would I do if this happened to me? Could I forgive? Would I ever trust again? The journey ahead is long, filled with twists, revelations, and emotional highs and lows. But by the end, you will see this story not just as a royal scandal, but as a profound meditation on the fragility of human connection in an age where privacy is fleeting and betrayal can come from those closest to us. And so, as Harry sat in that dimly lit room, the weight of realization crashing over him, the question that haunted him most was not just why, but when. When had the shift occurred? When had their tender moments ceased to be shared between two people in love and instead become material for future public consumption? Was it during the early days, when they escaped to Botswana under the stars, imagining a life far from the paparazzi's gaze? Was it as their wedding approached, with every glance and gesture scrutinized by a hungry press? Or had it been later, when tensions inside the palace began to boil and old wounds reopened? Harry had always seen himself as Meghan's protector. He believed, truly believed, that he had rescued her from the torment of the tabloids and the pressures of royal life. But this new discovery forced him to reckon with a painful possibility, that she may have been documenting their life together from the start, not as a way to cherish memories, but as a way to control the narrative, to shape a story that would one day be hers to tell, on her terms. This wasn't the first time Harry had felt betrayed by those he loved. The trauma of his mother's tragic death, pursued relentlessly by cameras and headlines, had carved a permanent scar. He had fought so hard to avoid that same fate for himself and his family. And yet here he was, realizing that the person he had trusted above all others had allegedly turned their home into a place where even their most intimate moments might one day be exposed to the world. For Harry, this realization was devastating. It wasn't just the recordings themselves. It was the loss of innocence, the collapse of what he thought was sacred. Conversations he believed were shared in absolute trust. Moments of vulnerability, joy, sorrow, were no longer safe in his mind. Every memory was now tainted by the suspicion that Meghan may have been crafting her own version of their reality all along. In this video, we will examine this collapse, the unraveling of trust, the erosion of emotional security, and the weight of betrayal when it comes not from strangers or distant family members, but from the person you share your life with. We will dive into the moments when Harry began to notice small things that didn't add up. A casual reference Meghan made to a conversation he didn't remember discussing publicly, a strange hesitance in her words when he asked about a recent conversation they had late one night. And as we piece this story together, we will explore a larger question that haunts so many relationships today. How do we protect what is private in a world where everything is content? In the age of memoirs, podcasts, interviews, and social media revelations, is any relationship truly private anymore? Or are we all, in some way, curating our lives for an audience, even those closest to us? Harry's heartbreak is not just the heartbreak of a man betrayed by his partner. It's the heartbreak of a man who tried to escape a lifetime of public scrutiny, only to find that scrutiny waiting for him at home. He sought refuge in love, and yet love itself became the stage for the very performance he feared most. This introduction serves as your entry point into that emotional journey. An intimate exploration of one man's reckoning with the disintegration of trust and the painful discovery that even the most sacred spaces can be breached. As we follow Harry's path, from disbelief to sorrow to a kind of resigned clarity, you will be invited to reflect on your own notions of privacy, intimacy, and betrayal. Because in the end, this is not just a royal story. It's a human story, a story about how fragile trust can be, about the damage done when the person we love becomes a chronicler of our private pain, and about the haunting realization that the most devastating betrayals often come not from enemies, but from those we hold dearest. In the coming sections, we will unpack each phase of this unfolding drama, the highs of their love story, the mounting pressures from the outside world, the subtle signs of fracture, and the devastating moment when Harry finally learned the truth. We will hear from friends, commentators, insiders, voices that help to paint a fuller picture of how this relationship evolved and why it may have fallen apart. And through it all, we will return again and again to Harry's chilling confession. She was writing our ending before I even knew we had one. This single line carries the weight of an entire emotional journey, a journey we are about to walk together. The road ahead is filled with heartbreak, anger, and moments of deep reflection. But it is also filled with lessons about love, trust, and what it means to truly share your life with another person in an age where privacy feels increasingly fragile. Stay with us as we begin this journey. The truth Harry uncovered is far more complex and painful than any tabloid headline can convey. And by the time we reach the end of this story, you may find yourself seeing not just Harry and Meghan differently, but the very nature of intimacy itself. From the very first moment they appeared together, the world was captivated. Prince Harry, the rebellious younger son of the future King of England, and Meghan Markle, a successful American actress known for her charm and charisma, seemed to embody a modern fairy tale. Their love story unfolded publicly, but in those early days it carried an aura of genuine connection that transcended titles, status, and even the heavy shadow of history that loomed over Harry's life. Their first date, a blind meeting arranged by a mutual friend, was shrouded in secrecy but charged with instant chemistry. Harry himself would later say he knew she was the one from their very first encounter, and Meghan, too, spoke glowingly of their immediate bond. There was something intoxicating about their story, two people from vastly different worlds drawn together by a shared sense of empathy and understanding. The prince, shaped by the loss of his mother and years of tabloid intrusion, and the actress, experienced in navigating fame and public scrutiny, appeared perfectly suited to protect one another from the storms around them. And in those early weeks, their love seemed untouchable. They managed to keep the budding romance out of the headlines, relishing in stolen moments and private escapes. There was a weekend in Botswana under the vast African sky, far from the flashbulbs and relentless coverage of the British press. There were quiet dinners, handwritten notes, and late-night conversations about hopes, fears, and the future they imagined building together. To outsiders, it was the perfect narrative. The prince who had struggled for so long to find peace finally meeting the woman who could understand and support him, a strong, independent partner willing to take on the challenges of royal life. The public, hungry for a new chapter in the royal saga, embraced them. The tabloids, usually quick to critique, seemed at first enchanted by the couple's glamour and undeniable chemistry. But even at this stage, subtle tensions simmered beneath the surface. Friends close to Harry noticed how quickly he became consumed by his new relationship. Longtime confidants spoke of a distance growing between them and Harry as he spent increasing amounts of time with Meghan. He seemed determined to protect this new love at all costs, perhaps driven by the trauma of watching his mother's life and death play out under public scrutiny. For Harry, Meghan represented both sanctuary and salvation. Meanwhile, inside palace walls, courtiers and senior royals began to whisper. Was this romance moving too fast? Was Meghan, with her Hollywood background and unapologetic independence, truly prepared for life inside the firm? These questions remained unspoken publicly, but behind closed doors there was apprehension. The British monarchy is an ancient institution, steeped in protocol and tradition, and Harry's choice of partner challenged many of its unspoken rules. For Meghan, stepping into this world was like crossing into another universe. The rigid hierarchy, the expectations of deference, the endless scrutiny. It was a far cry from the freedom she had known as an actress and activist in Los Angeles and Toronto. Yet in those first few months, she appeared willing to adapt, to mold herself into the role of a royal fiancée. Publicly, she smiled and played the part impeccably, winning admirers with her grace and style. But behind the scenes, small cracks were beginning to form. Meghan's natural confidence and outspokenness, traits that had served her well in her career, sometimes clashed with palace traditions. Harry, fiercely protective, began pushing back against what he saw as unreasonable constraints placed on his future wife. The two of them became an increasingly insular unit, leaning on each other for support while keeping the outside world, including parts of Harry's own family, at bay. In hindsight, those early days contained the seeds of the tension that would later engulf them both. The pressures of royal life, the expectations of the public, and the heavy burden of history were already bearing down on their relationship, even as they smiled for the cameras and projected the image of a perfect match. Yet through it all, Harry believed their bond was unshakable. He saw Meghan as his anchor in a storm, the woman who would help him build a life far from the traumas of his past. Their engagement, announced to great fanfare, seemed to confirm that belief. In their televised interview following the announcement, Harry spoke with genuine emotion about his love for Meghan and his excitement for the future. Meghan, too, appeared radiant, expressing her admiration for Harry and her eagerness to embrace her new role. The wedding, watched by millions around the world, was a spectacle of modern royalty. From the gospel choir to Meghan's elegant simplicity, the ceremony symbolized a new era for the monarchy, inclusive, multicultural, and forward-looking. Harry and Meghan's love story was held up as a sign that even the most rigid of institutions could evolve, could adapt to a changing world. But while the public narrative was one of triumph and romance, privately the couple was already feeling the strain. The demands of royal protocol clashed with their desire for independence. The relentless media coverage, while initially adoring, soon turned critical. Every gesture, every word, every decision they made was analyzed and often twisted into controversy. And Harry, haunted by memories of his mother's torment at the hands of the press, found himself growing increasingly defensive and isolated. It was during this period, when the world still believed in the fairy tale, that Meghan allegedly began to keep a record of their conversations and private moments. According to those who would later speak about it, this habit did not raise immediate alarms. After all, many people keep journals or make recordings to document their lives, particularly during times of great transition. And yet, as we will discover in the coming chapters, this seemingly innocuous behavior would take on a far more sinister significance for Harry when he realized that these records were not simply for personal reflection, but might have been intended for future publication. Looking back, the fairy tale was already showing signs of strain. The perfect couple, the golden romance, was quietly unraveling behind closed doors. And for Harry, the man who had spent his life trying to protect those he loved from the harsh glare of the public eye, the realization that his own wife might be preparing to share their most intimate moments with the world was a betrayal that would cut deeper than any tabloid headline ever could. This chapter marks the beginning of that unraveling, a reminder that even the most beautiful stories can hide complexity beneath their surface, that even the brightest fairy tales can contain shadows. As we move forward, we will see how the pressures of royal life and the corrosive power of mistrust began to erode the foundation of Harry and Meghan's relationship, setting the stage for the revelations that would ultimately rock not just their marriage, but the entire royal family. the story is only just beginning. If the early months of Harry and Meghan's relationship felt like a secret garden where love could flourish, marriage dragged them squarely into the blinding glare of public life. The fairy tale was now fully on display, and the demands of royal duty and global celebrity left no room for pause. Every move they made became news. Every gesture was dissected, debated, and framed as symbolic of something far larger than two people simply building a life together. For Harry, this scrutiny was both familiar and unbearable. He had grown up under the camera's lens, watched his mother chased, hounded, and reduced to front-page fodder until the very moment of her tragic death. Even as a boy, he understood that he was part of a performance, a royal drama the public felt entitled to consume. But the loss of Diana didn't inoculate him against future pain. Instead, it planted a deep and abiding fear that history would repeat itself. Now married, Harry's old anxieties surged with fresh urgency. He was determined not to let Meghan suffer as Diana had suffered. He saw every headline as a potential attack, every intrusion as a direct threat to her well-being. His protective instincts, rooted in grief, often led him to overcompensate, issuing statements, challenging press coverage, and railing against institutions he believed should defend them but didn't. And Meghan, for her part, found herself on a path she hadn't fully anticipated. The British royal family was not merely an extended family. It was a rigid, hierarchical institution governed by centuries of protocol, with invisible but very real expectations. Decisions about wardrobe, posture, speech, and schedule were no longer hers to make freely. There were advisors for everything, and much of the advice centered on how not to draw attention. A paradox, given her celebrity status and the public fascination surrounding her. At first, Meghan seemed willing to play this part. She attended royal engagements with grace, learned the customs, and adhered to the complex etiquette of court life. But inside, friends say she was struggling. Used to independence, she bristled at restrictions. Used to speaking freely on issues she cared about, she found her voice carefully curated and sometimes silenced. And all the while, her every step was chronicled by the media, sometimes flattering, sometimes vicious, but always relentless. The headlines began to shift subtly at first. Where once she had been celebrated as a breath of fresh air, Meghan now found herself criticized for seemingly trivial things. The way she held Harry's hand, her choice of nail polish, even how she closed a car door. The scrutiny was not merely harsh. It often felt personal, and at times even racialized, invoking ugly stereotypes and coded language that painted her as a disruptive force within the monarchy. For Harry, the change in tone was intolerable. He had watched this pattern before. The honeymoon period with Diana had given way to relentless attacks when she failed to conform to royal expectations. And now, he believed, the same was happening to Meghan. But where Diana had often suffered in silence, Harry fought back, issuing public statements condemning what he saw as the press's racist undertones and relentless harassment. These statements did not always sit well inside the palace. The royal family's long-standing ethos of never complain, never explain, meant that Harry's public responses were viewed as breaches of protocol, drawing further attention to issues that might have otherwise faded from the headlines. The tension between Harry and palace aides began to grow, with Harry convinced that more could and should be done to protect Meghan, and palace officials concerned that Harry's approach was inflaming rather than calming the media storm. All of this played out in a crucible of pressure that most couples could scarcely imagine. The newlyweds were not only navigating the normal challenges of adjusting to married life, but doing so under the gaze of millions, with every misstep magnified and every disagreement potentially becoming fodder for public speculation. Behind closed doors, Harry and Meghan became increasingly insular, drawing tighter boundaries around their private life. They sought refuge in their home, Frogmore Cottage, but even there the press intrusion persisted. Paparazzi drones reportedly hovered overhead, neighbors were allegedly recruited as informants, and tabloids published stories about the minutiae of their domestic life. This climate of suspicion and siege took its toll. Friends noticed that Meghan began to withdraw, feeling isolated and misunderstood. Harry, too, seemed increasingly anxious, burdened by the twin pressures of protecting his wife and managing his own growing resentment toward the media, the palace, and even, at times, his own family. But it was in this atmosphere, one of suspicion, isolation, and siege mentality, that something far more intimate began to happen behind the scenes. Meghan allegedly started to document their private moments in earnest. Journals, recordings, careful notes, all of it accumulating quietly, with Harry unaware of the extent or purpose of these records. To an outside observer, this might have seemed benign. Many people keep journals, after all, particularly during times of upheaval. But for Harry, who would only discover the extent of this documentation later, these records would come to symbolize the ultimate betrayal. A private life shared in trust, quietly transformed into a narrative for future publication. And so even as they smiled for cameras, attended royal functions, and prepared to welcome their first child, there were undercurrents of tension that only they could feel fully. The very pressures that should have bound them together more closely, love in the face of adversity, were instead driving invisible wedges between them, creating cracks in the foundation that neither of them publicly acknowledged at the time. Friends close to the couple have said that Harry remained deeply in love during this period, determined to protect Meghan from the forces he felt had destroyed his mother. But what he didn't realize, what he couldn't have realized then, was that within the sanctuary of their own home, a parallel story was being quietly constructed, written in Meghan's voice, from her perspective, in her words. A memoir in the making, perhaps. Or perhaps something less calculated but no less hurtful, a record of their shared life, kept without his knowledge or consent. Looking back now, it is impossible not to see the irony. Harry's greatest fear was the intrusion of outsiders into his private life, yet the deepest intrusion, the one that would hurt the most, came from within the walls of his own home. The relentless gaze of the media was brutal, but at least it was expected. The documentation of his private conversations, his most vulnerable moments, was something far more intimate, far more devastating. As we leave this chapter, the stage is set for the emotional unraveling that will follow. The fairy tale romance, once celebrated by the world, is now under siege, not only from the outside but from within. The love story that began with promises of protection and sanctuary is heading toward a confrontation neither of them could have fully anticipated. In the next chapter, we will explore how Meghan's private habit of journaling and recording would later come to light, and how Harry's discovery of this habit marked the beginning of the end, not just of trust, but of the narrative they had so carefully built together. In many relationships, the act of documenting life's journey can be seen as harmless, even sentimental. Diaries, journals, recordings of vacations, candid photos of quiet moments together. These are the artifacts of memory, small ways of holding on to time that inevitably slips away. But in Harry and Meghan's case, what began as a personal habit would later take on a more ominous meaning, and for Harry, it would become the catalyst for heartbreak. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Meghan had always carried a small notebook in her handbag, and Harry never thought much of it. She would jot down thoughts occasionally, sometimes smiling quietly as she scribbled, or pausing mid-conversation to write a quick note before returning to the moment at hand. At the time, Harry saw it as a charming quirk, a sign of Meghan's mindfulness and attention to detail, qualities he admired about her. She was known among friends to be an avid journaler even before meeting Harry, often writing reflections after busy days on set or keeping notes about her thoughts and feelings. In the early stages of their relationship, this habit seemed perfectly natural, even endearing. It was part of who she was, thoughtful, introspective, careful in curating her experience of the world around her. But as time passed and life in the royal family grew more complex, Meghan's note-taking reportedly became more frequent, more deliberate. Harry began to notice that she would sometimes retreat after particularly emotional conversations, notebook in hand, to write in private. After tense discussions about the press, family tensions, or even disagreements between them, she would quietly excuse herself, pen poised to capture something, though Harry did not yet understand what. Friends close to Meghan would later defend this practice, saying she needed an outlet for her thoughts, especially given the immense pressures she faced. After all, she was a woman navigating a notoriously rigid institution, subject to constant criticism, and expected to conform while simultaneously being praised for her individuality. Journaling was her refuge, they argued, a private space where she could make sense of it all. But for Harry, the realization of what these notes might actually represent would come much later, and when it did, it would devastate him. There were small signs along the way that began to trouble him, even if he couldn't articulate why. A conversation they had about his late mother would resurface later, with Meghan recalling exact phrasing that Harry didn't remember sharing so openly. Sometimes she would reference past disagreements with uncanny precision, quoting back words he had spoken months earlier in moments of vulnerability. He wondered privately how she remembered so much, but his love and trust in her overpowered his doubt, and he dismissed the feeling each time it arose. Unbeknownst to Harry, Meghan's documentation extended beyond mere journaling. It wasn't just notes scribbled for self-reflection. It was meticulous, detailed recording of the private contours of their life together. Conversations, emotional exchanges, Harry's most intimate admissions, all captured, cataloged, and preserved. Whether in written form or audio recordings, the extent of this documentation was staggering when he eventually learned of it. The question that would torment Harry later was simple but excruciating. Why? Why would someone who professed love, loyalty, and partnership feel the need to document these private moments so thoroughly? Was it an innocent habit rooted in self-care, or was it premeditated, a conscious effort to shape a narrative that could one day be shared publicly? The stakes were even higher given Meghan's position. She was not simply journaling as a private citizen. She was the Duchess of Sussex, a member of the British royal family, whose every word and action carried public weight. A memoir penned by Meghan would inevitably become a global sensation, scrutinized by press and public alike, dissected by historians, and interpreted as an insider account of one of the world's most closely watched families. Even before Meghan and Harry stepped back from royal duties, whispers of a possible memoir had circulated quietly in publishing circles. Industry insiders speculated that Meghan's story, from Hollywood to Buckingham Palace and beyond, would command a record-breaking advance. Some suggested that Meghan herself may have felt the pressure, or perhaps the opportunity, to control her own narrative, to tell her side of the story in a world where so many others were eager to speak for her. If that was the case, was it so unreasonable for her to keep records? To ensure that her version of events would be accurate, documented, unimpeachable? From Meghan's perspective, it may have felt like a necessary safeguard, a way to preserve truth in an environment where truth was so often distorted or spun. But for Harry, none of that mattered. What mattered was that he hadn't known. He hadn't consented. Their most vulnerable conversations, words spoken in trust, often at his lowest moments, were not simply between them. They had been observed, captured, and stored, without his understanding or agreement. That knowledge would strike him like a thunderclap when he finally realized the extent of it. The discovery itself, sources claim, was almost accidental. Harry allegedly stumbled upon a file on Meghan's laptop, a file filled with notes, transcripts, and recordings. At first, confusion reigned. Why was this here? What was it for? But as he scrolled through the contents, realization began to dawn. These were not scattered musings or diary entries. They were detailed, systematic, covering conversations they'd had over months, perhaps years. A sickening feeling settled in his stomach as he recognized his own words, his own voice, preserved in a context he never intended to be permanent. It was as if the ground beneath him shifted, as though he no longer knew what was real and what was performance. Had every moment been authentic? Or had some moments been shaped or even provoked, knowing they might one day appear in print? This chapter of the story reveals a profound and deeply human question about trust. When we speak candidly to those closest to us, we assume those words live and die in the privacy of that relationship. The very act of vulnerability depends on that assumption. To discover that our words have been preserved, archived, perhaps for a future audience, that discovery fractures the very intimacy that makes love possible. Harry was left to grapple not just with Meghan's motivations, but with the implications for their entire relationship. Was he living with a partner, or with an author in waiting? Were their private struggles simply that, private struggles, or material for a memoir? Every memory, every tender moment, every argument now felt tainted by suspicion. As the reality of Meghan's private documentation habit settled over him, Harry's internal conflict deepened. He wanted to believe in her innocence, to trust that her journaling and recording were harmless, even therapeutic. But the context, the whispers of a forthcoming book, the rumors of publishing deals, made it impossible to see this practice as benign. What once seemed like a charming quirk had transformed, in Harry's mind, into the symbol of a much larger betrayal. It wasn't just that Meghan had kept records, it was that she had done so without transparency and perhaps with a future audience in mind. The woman he thought he knew intimately had been, in some ways, crafting a version of their life together that was hers alone to control. And so, even as they smiled in public and spoke of unity and love, behind closed doors Harry was wrestling with a growing sense of unease. The cracks in their marriage, invisible to the outside world, were widening. Trust, so essential in any relationship, but especially in one under the extraordinary pressures they faced, was beginning to erode. In the next chapter, we will examine the moment when this habit came to light in full, and how Harry confronted Meghan about it. We will explore how this discovery changed the dynamic between them, shifting their marriage from partnership to something far more fragile and uncertain. The moment Harry discovered the recordings would become, in hindsight, the precise point at which everything changed. The distance between suspicion and certainty is often wide and torturous, but in Harry's case it narrowed in an instant, and the impact was devastating. It was a quiet afternoon. The sunlight filtering through the windows did little to soften the weight of exhaustion Harry felt after another tense discussion with palace aides about security arrangements and public engagements. Meghan was out at a nearby cafe, giving Harry a rare moment alone in the house. As he sat at Meghan's desk, searching for a document they had discussed earlier, his attention was caught by a folder on her laptop, a folder innocuously labeled but clearly private. At first, he hesitated. To open it would be a breach of trust, something Harry himself would have condemned in any other situation. But something gnawed at him, a quiet discomfort that had built up over weeks and months. His mind flicked back to all the little moments that hadn't added up, the way Meghan sometimes recounted their arguments with startling precision, the way she recalled phrases he could barely remember uttering. Curiosity, suspicion, or perhaps a desperate need for clarity overrode his hesitation. He clicked the folder open. What he found was far beyond anything he could have anticipated. Dozens of subfolders, each organized by date and subject. Files labeled with titles that referenced private conversations they'd had, late-night talks, emotional confessions, discussions about the royal family, his fears and insecurities. Some folders contained transcripts so detailed that reading them felt like reliving those moments all over again, but with the unsettling knowledge that they had been captured without his consent. And then there were the audio files. Heart-pounding, Harry clicked on one. His own voice filled the room, soft and vulnerable, recounting a story from his childhood, a memory of his mother, Princess Diana, comforting him after he'd had a nightmare. He remembered this conversation vividly. It had taken place months earlier, during a night when he and Meghan had spoken late into the evening, wrapped in a blanket on their patio, sharing childhood memories. He had spoken freely that night, believing he was safe, believing he was heard and understood by someone who loved him. And yet, here it was, not simply a memory shared between them, but an audio file, stored, cataloged, and preserved. Harry's mind raced. Why would Meghan have recorded that moment? Why any of these moments? As he scrolled through the list of files, he saw more and more conversations that he remembered vividly. Intimate, emotional exchanges that were never meant for anyone else's ears. Some were serious, some trivial, but all were personal. The betrayal hit him in waves. At first came disbelief. This must be a misunderstanding, an accident, some technical glitch that had led to these recordings existing. Then came anger. How long had this been going on? Had Meghan always intended to document their private life? For what purpose? And finally came sorrow, a deep, gnawing ache at the realization that the privacy he had so desperately sought, that he thought he had finally secured in this relationship, had been an illusion all along. When Meghan returned home that afternoon, she immediately sensed the shift in atmosphere. Harry, usually warm and affectionate, sat rigidly in the armchair, laptop closed, his gaze heavy with hurt. There was a pause, a silence between them that spoke volumes. And then Harry asked, simply, "Why?" His voice, low and raw, was not filled with rage but with pain. The kind of pain that comes when you realize that someone you love has betrayed your trust in ways you never imagined possible. Meghan sat down slowly. According to sources close to the couple, what followed was a conversation filled with tension, tears, and attempts at justification. Meghan explained that she kept records because she felt isolated and unheard, that journaling and documentation helped her process the turmoil of their lives. She may have even suggested that one day, these records could serve as a safeguard, a way to protect herself and their narrative from distortions. But to Harry, these explanations offered no comfort. They only deepened the wound. His most vulnerable words, the parts of himself he had shared in confidence, had not been held close but catalogued, preserved not just in her memory, but as files that could, at any moment, become public. Whether or not Meghan had intended to share them didn't matter. The very act of recording them without his knowledge shattered his trust. Harry, who had spent his entire life watching his every word for fear it would be twisted and published, had finally allowed himself to speak freely. But in the one place where he thought he was safe, he had been recorded. This discovery would mark a turning point in their relationship. From this day forward, the dynamic between them changed irrevocably. Conversations that had once flowed freely became stilted. Harry found himself second-guessing every word, wondering whether it, too, was being archived somewhere. The warmth and intimacy that had characterized their bond were replaced by suspicion and restraint. Even their public appearances began to reflect this tension. Observers who once remarked on their easy affection now noted a distance, a coolness that hadn't been there before. Body language experts began to speculate about signs of strain, but few could have imagined the private discovery that had fueled this shift. As weeks turned into months, Harry wrestled with how to process what he had uncovered. On the one hand, he still loved Meghan deeply and wanted to believe in her intentions. On the other, he couldn't escape the feeling that something sacred between them had been violated. The sanctuary he thought they had built together had been breached from within. Meanwhile, rumors of a potential memoir began to circulate in earnest. Publishing insiders whispered that Meghan's story would fetch a record-breaking advance, with publishers eager to capitalize on the global fascination with her life and her perspective on the royal family. To Harry, these whispers became intolerable. Every headline about a book deal felt like confirmation that his worst fears were true. In private, Harry confronted Meghan again and again, seeking answers that could restore his faith in their relationship. But the trust had already begun to crumble. Each conversation about the recordings reopened the wound, making reconciliation harder with every attempt. This was not a betrayal that could be easily forgiven or forgotten. It cut to the very heart of what Harry believed their relationship to be, a refuge from the public eye, a place where he could finally speak freely and be himself. To discover that even this sanctuary had been compromised was, for Harry, a loss far more profound than any media scandal or public humiliation he had endured before. As this chapter closes, Harry's world is no longer defined by the binary of public versus private, but by a deeper fracture. The realization that the one person he trusted most may have been preparing a narrative all along. The fairy tale, already under strain from external pressures, was now collapsing from within. In the next chapter, we will explore the emotional fallout of this discovery, the arguments, the silences, the growing chasm between Harry and Meghan as trust eroded day by day, and how this secret began to poison even the most ordinary moments of their life together. In the aftermath of the discovery, the atmosphere inside their home changed in ways that were immediate and yet painfully gradual. On the surface, their life continued. Public appearances were made, engagements attended, polite smiles offered to cameras. But behind closed doors, a silence had settled that spoke more than words ever could. It was the silence of trust eroding, of questions unanswered, of love now shadowed by doubt. Harry, once so open and affectionate, withdrew. He spoke less, retreated more, and found himself observing Meghan in a way he never had before, not as a partner, but as someone whose intentions he could no longer fully trust. Every conversation carried a weight, a hesitance, as if the words themselves might one day resurface outside the walls of their home. He wondered now, was this moment being documented too? Was this apology, this argument, this quiet meal, all of it destined for future publication? Meghan noticed, of course, the distance, the change in tone, the guarded looks. And for her, this too was a betrayal of sorts. She had her reasons, she argued during their most heated exchanges. She felt cornered, attacked by the press, unsupported by the palace, and journaling helped her cope. She needed to capture her thoughts, she said, before they were drowned out by the relentless noise of the media. In her mind, this was about survival, not betrayal. But to Harry, none of this could explain away the deep sense of violation he felt. He had given her his heart, his fears, his memories of Diana, raw and unfiltered, believing that they would remain between them. He had finally spoken freely after a lifetime of holding so much inside, only to discover that even this freedom had been an illusion. The arguments between them intensified. At first, they tried to talk it through calmly, but these conversations always circled back to the same place. Harry asking why, Meghan explaining and defending, Harry not feeling heard or reassured. Their once effortless communication became fraught with misunderstandings and unspoken resentment. Nights that used to be filled with quiet laughter and shared stories turned cold. Meals were eaten in silence. Small gestures of affection, a touch on the arm, a smile from across the table, became rare. Even their interactions with Archie, their young son, took on a strained quality as Harry found himself torn between his love for his family and the pain he could not shake. The emotional fallout was not just confined to their private life. It began to seep into their public image as well. Observers noted how Meghan's radiant smile appeared less genuine, how Harry seemed distracted during engagements, how their body language spoke of distance rather than intimacy. Speculation in the press intensified, though few could have imagined the real reason for the growing tension. For Harry, the home that was meant to be his sanctuary became a place of constant unease. Every time he saw Meghan writing, every time he noticed her phone placed near them during a conversation, he wondered if she was still documenting their lives. His mind ran in circles, questioning whether even their reconciliations were sincere or simply more material for future chapters. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild, especially when that trust was the very foundation of their relationship. Harry had believed that he and Meghan were a team, united against the outside world. Now, he felt isolated even in her presence. The one person who was supposed to protect his heart had, in his eyes, pierced it instead. The emotional toll was immense. Harry, never far from the ghosts of his past, found himself haunted anew. His mother's legacy loomed larger than ever. Diana had felt unheard, unloved, and used by an institution she couldn't control. Harry feared he was reliving that trauma, not at the hands of the press or palace, but within his own marriage. He found himself pulling away from not just Meghan, but also friends and family. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations declined. He became consumed by the internal struggle between love and betrayal, between wanting to heal and being unable to forget. Every day felt like a test of patience, of forgiveness, of endurance. And Meghan, for all her explanations, felt misunderstood and cornered herself. She too was hurting, feeling that her attempts to cope were being weaponized against her. She believed she had never intended to hurt Harry, that her journaling was her way of finding clarity amidst the chaos of their lives. But intentions mattered little now. What mattered was the impact, and the impact was profound. As the distance between them grew, so too did their inability to repair the damage. Therapy sessions were attempted. Long walks meant for reconnection often ended in silence or more arguments. Both seemed trapped in a cycle of hurt that neither could escape. Even in moments of apparent peace, Harry felt a nagging anxiety. Had this truly ended? Was Meghan still recording, still documenting, still preserving their lives for a future audience? This question hung over every interaction, every attempt at rebuilding trust. The emotional fallout began affecting decisions large and small. Plans they once made enthusiastically, travels, projects, family goals, were quietly abandoned or delayed. The very future they had dreamed of together was now uncertain, clouded by suspicion and unresolved hurt. And outside their home, the world continued watching, unaware of the true nature of their struggle. The fairy tale romance that had once captivated millions was fraying at the seams, not because of external pressures alone, but because of a deeply personal fracture between two people who had loved each other fiercely and sincerely, but whose trust had been irreparably damaged. By the end of this chapter, Harry was a changed man. More withdrawn, more guarded, less certain of everything he had once believed about his marriage. Meghan, too, felt isolated, cut off not just from the royal family and the public, but from the man she had once seen as her strongest ally. This was not just a relationship strained by public scrutiny. It was a relationship quietly breaking apart from within. And the tapes, those private recordings that Harry could not stop thinking about, had become the symbol of everything that had gone wrong. In the next chapter, we will turn to the heart of this unraveling, the revelation that Meghan's documentation may not have been merely a private coping mechanism, but part of a deliberate plan for a memoir that would tell her story, and, by extension, Harry's, to the world. For weeks after the discovery of the recordings, Harry wrestled with uncertainty. His thoughts cycled through disbelief, sadness, and resentment. But through it all, a singular question haunted him. What was all this documentation really for? In private moments, he convinced himself that Meghan's intentions were innocent, that her notes and recordings were simply a way to cope, a cathartic exercise for a woman under immense pressure. But when he allowed himself to think more deeply, he couldn't shake the fear that there was more to it, something premeditated and far-reaching. That fear would soon crystallize into devastating clarity. It happened in the way these things often do: a careless comment overheard, an email glimpse, a conversation that was never meant for his ears. According to those close to the couple, it began with a phone call. Meghan had stepped away to take a private call with a close friend, but Harry, passing by the study, caught a few words that froze him in his tracks. "The material is all there. I've been keeping everything. It'll be powerful when the time is right," Meghan said, her voice low but steady. The words echoed in his mind long after the call ended. The material, all there, powerful when the time is right. Harry felt as if the walls around him closed in. His mind raced as he pieced together the clues that had been there all along, but which he had willed himself to ignore. The meticulous notes, the detailed recollections, the recordings that stretched back months, possibly years. This wasn't just a private diary. This was an archive. And archives have audiences. What followed was a confrontation unlike any they had had before. Harry, unable to contain the swirl of emotions inside him, demanded answers. "What is this about?" he asked. "Are you planning to write a book? Have you been collecting our life for a memoir?" The accusation hung heavy in the air. Meghan's response, according to sources familiar with their private conversations, was measured but defensive. She denied any malicious intent, insisting that she was merely protecting their truth, that she wanted to ensure their side of the story would never be distorted by outsiders. But the damage was done. Her very admission that she was preserving material suggested intent, a future project, a narrative that would be hers to tell, on her terms. Harry's worst fears were realized. Their love story, their arguments, their reconciliations, their raw and private moments. All of it might one day appear in print. The sanctuary he believed they had built was gone. Even more devastating was the realization that Meghan had perhaps seen this possibility from the very beginning. The very phrase, "writing our ending before I knew we had one," took on a new and painful clarity for Harry now. He had believed that their life together was unfolding in real time, that every moment they shared was authentic, unscripted. But now he wondered, had she been scripting it all along? The public, of course, remained unaware of these private revelations. To the world, Harry and Meghan were still the glamorous couple forging their own path, battling the press, and redefining modern royal life. But behind the smiles and public appearances, an emotional chasm had opened between them. Harry found himself unable to trust her words or actions. Every interaction carried the weight of suspicion. Was this genuine, or was this another scene in a story being prepared for future readers? Could he laugh freely, cry openly, share his fears without wondering whether those moments, too, were being collected? Meghan, for her part, felt misunderstood and increasingly isolated. She believed she was fighting for autonomy, for the right to reclaim her own story from a media machine determined to vilify her. To her, the documentation was about truth and agency, ensuring that if the day ever came when her voice was needed, she would have the evidence to back it up. But Harry saw only betrayal. He had lived his entire life under the gaze of cameras, the weight of headlines, and the distortion of tabloid narratives. He had trusted Meghan as his escape from that world. Now he felt trapped again, but in a far more intimate way, exposed not to tabloids or photographers, but to the very person he had believed would protect him most. Friends who observed them during this period described a palpable tension. Harry appeared withdrawn, guarded, and somber, while Meghan seemed both defensive and saddened by the growing distance between them. The atmosphere in their home was heavy, with silences that spoke of emotional wounds neither could articulate fully. In moments of reflection, Harry wondered whether this had been inevitable. Had Meghan always intended to write her own memoir? Had she seen their relationship, in part, as a story that could someday be told, a means of reclaiming her narrative? Or had the pressures of royal life and the unrelenting attacks from the press pushed her into this position, driven by self-preservation rather than malice? These questions offered no comfort, only more anguish. Regardless of her intentions, the impact was the same. The trust between them was broken. The foundation of their relationship, built on the belief that they could share anything with each other, safe from the outside world, had crumbled. As rumors in the publishing world continued to swirl, Harry became increasingly paranoid. Every time Meghan took a call in another room, he wondered if it was a publisher on the other end. Every time she typed on her laptop late at night, he feared another chapter was being written. The emotional toll of this suspicion was immense, leaving him feeling isolated. This chapter of their story is about more than just betrayal. It is about the fragility of trust itself. It is about how even the closest relationships can fracture under the weight of secrecy and fear. And it is about the profound loneliness that comes when the one person you thought you could confide in becomes, in your mind, a potential chronicler of your most private pain. As the memoir revelation set in, Harry began to question the very nature of their love story. Had he been naive? Had he misjudged her intentions from the start? Or was this simply a tragic misunderstanding, fueled by the extraordinary pressures they both faced? The answers to these questions remained elusive. What was clear, however, was that their marriage had fundamentally changed. The distance between them was no longer just emotional, it was existential. Their future, once so full of promise, now felt uncertain, shadowed by doubt, suspicion, and heartbreak. In the next chapter, we will explore how Harry sought solace among friends, and how even those confidences would soon become entangled in a web of leaks, rumors, and media speculation, deepening the crisis and driving Harry further into isolation. When the weight of suspicion became too heavy to carry alone, Harry did something he hadn't done in a long time. He reached out to a close circle of friends. For most of his life, Harry had carefully guarded his private world. Years of being burned by betrayal, from former staff to distant acquaintances who sold stories to tabloids, had taught him to be wary, even of those who claimed loyalty. But now, feeling isolated inside his own marriage and unable to reconcile the hurt he felt, he needed somewhere to turn. In quiet, private conversations, Harry confided in those he believed he could trust completely. Friends who had stood by him before Meghan, friends who knew his vulnerabilities, who had been there through his grief over Diana, through his struggles to define his role in the royal family, through his moments of self-doubt and rebellion. These friends became his lifeline, a sounding board as he tried to make sense of the storm raging inside him. In these intimate exchanges, Harry spoke frankly about what he had discovered, the recordings, the journals, the conversation he overheard suggesting Meghan was preparing material for a memoir. His emotions swung between heartbreak and anger as he shared his fears that his most private moments had not only been recorded, but could one day become public knowledge. His friends listened with sympathy and concern. Some tried to offer perspective, suggesting that perhaps Meghan's intentions were not as sinister as they seemed. Others urged caution, warning Harry to tread carefully before making any assumptions. A few, however, confirmed what Harry feared most, that this situation sounded deeply troubling and could point to a betrayal far more calculated than he wanted to believe. But no matter the advice, the mere act of speaking about it brought Harry some relief. For the first time since his discovery, he felt less alone. He believed, or perhaps desperately hoped, that this circle of confidants would protect his confidence, that these conversations would remain private. And then came the first leak. It began subtly, as these things often do. A vague story in a tabloid about tensions inside Harry and Meghan's home. The article hinted at private disagreements, citing unnamed sources close to the couple. Harry read the piece with a sinking feeling, recognizing phrases that mirrored things he had said in confidence to one of his friends. At first, he told himself it was coincidence. The press often speculated and got lucky. But then came more leaks. Each successive story revealed details that could only have come from someone who knew exactly what Harry was struggling with. References to his feelings of betrayal, hints that Meghan was keeping detailed notes of their life together, suggestions that Harry was feeling isolated and unsure of their future. These weren't wild guesses by the media. These were details Harry had shared with his inner circle. The betrayal hit him with staggering force. Not only had he felt exposed inside his marriage, now he was exposed among his friends as well. The very people he had turned to for support, hoping to find clarity and comfort, had become conduits for the very publicity he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The leaks compounded his anguish. Now, not only did he feel he couldn't trust Meghan, he also felt he couldn't trust those around him. The walls were closing in from every side. Even in private, there was no longer a space where he felt safe to speak freely. The paranoia grew. He wondered which of his friends had betrayed him, and whether their motivations were financial, opportunistic, or simply careless. This chapter of Harry's life was marked by isolation that felt total. His trust, first in Meghan, now in his closest friends, had been shattered. Every relationship was now suspect. Every conversation tinged with doubt. He pulled further inward, retreating from social engagements, avoiding phone calls, ignoring text messages. The very people he had once leaned on were now, in his mind, possible sources of betrayal. The leaks also had a profound impact on his relationship with Meghan.